and I'll be a bit blunt about it. Australia has a long history of xenophobia. It runs like a deep scar through our national psyche. We have since the beginning of colonization, we've had a racist policy. We have had a white minority that is very fearful that its rights and privileges would be swamped by its neighbors because we're surrounded by Asia. So periodically through the country's history, they've had scares. Firstly, they dealt with the original inhabitants, which resulted in what we call the frontier wars. It took them about 80 to 100 years to subdue them. Then we had this problem with the Chinese. They came in, there were riots and pogroms against the Chinese. Then there was this idea that white people couldn't work in the tropics, so they brought the Melanesians to cut the cane. And we had the same problem again. So we've had this repeated problem, and in 1900 we passed a constitution that relegated the first inhabitants of our continent. And just remember, they had a 40,000-year unbroken history. They were part of the flora and fauna of the country. It was only in 1967 that we actually acknowledged that they existed. All right. Also in 1900, they passed something called the Dictation Test. Now, if you're a white Irish person or Anglo-Saxon person immigrating to Australia, remember this is a country of immigration, they could basically, you would probably be asked to do the test in English. But if you were Chinese, you were probably asked to do the test in Swahili. So it was a very cunning way to prevent non-white people to come into this country. So the groundwork was already laid because the refugees that are coming currently to this country are not white refugees. They're from Islamic countries and Asian countries that are fleeing whatever terrors their governments are imposing and also what Western governments are imposing on them. So that's the situation. And Australia's policy is an extremely harsh policy. Extremely harsh. And what's happened is it's almost like a detention center. They have basically outsourced the detention to poor countries. Countries that can barely manage, that already have a fractious relationship. Their governments are extremely corrupt, right? And these governments are bribed to take these people. There's no proper infrastructure. Like, for example, in Papua New Guinea, they've taken people's traditional land to build these detention centers. So already, the local inhabitants are pissed off, excuse the French, about these people coming in. So you have this continual push and pull. And at the same time, the detention facilities are horrible. And they already damaged people that have come. So they're already suffering disorder. So they come and they self-harm, they commit suicide, including the Tamils. I don't want to just isolate the Tamils because they're people from Africa, people from the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, you name it. They're all suffering. The majority of them are basically suffering from what they call post-traumatic stress. And how do we know this? It's because for the period of when we've had this compulsory detention, is that there have been whistleblowers galore. Whether they're prison guards, whether they're psychiatrists, or they're doctors, childcare workers, you name it. There have been a number of human rights reports, even government reports that say that this is an untenable, cruel policy, but the government does not heed it because it wins because a certain minority in our country, unfortunately, hear the dog's whistle of racism. Currently, the dog whistle we're hearing is about African crime rates in our country. Now, in particular, people from South Sudan. They make about 0.05% of our population. And there's some incidences where young men commit crime. But 98% of the crime is not committed by them. It's committed by the majority population. So it's within this context that I want to talk about what happens to the Tamil refugees. Now, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade writes something called country reports. And I and a number of us had the privilege of reading their country report on Sri Lanka. Now, I don't even think it would pass an undergraduate essay. What it is a series of statements. So it might say something like there's 90,000 women that are the heads of households in a war-torn area. They will say that they suffer continual harassment from the occupation forces, right? And that rape and abduction is quite common. They'll also go on to say that the justice system in Sri Lanka is flawed and it doesn't work and it's corrupt. But then it will conclude to say, but things are improving and it's safe. So there's no correlation between the facts presented and the conclusion. Basically, what happens is they take the advice of the Sri Lankan government. Now, the Sri Lankan government came into power on a wave of discontent from the previous government, which was a very harsh, corrupt government, and they promised reform. But all they've done is talk about reform. And Sri Lanka has a long history of talking about reform and doing nothing. It's happened in 1970, it's happened in 1977, 1991, even happened straight after the war, but nothing has been done. All that's happened is that the politicians enrich themselves and the democratic space for civic society gets smaller. So this DFAT report is a report that meets the government's agenda, and the reason, one of the ways that you can see it meets the government's agenda is because the facts belie the conclusions. Also, when we were doing our investigation, we discovered that DFAT signed a memo of understanding between the Sri Lankan government and them about giving them boats to prevent people smugglers. And they signed a memo of understanding with the Navy. And anybody who has some understanding of Sri Lankan history knows that people can't leave Sri Lanka without the connivance of the Navy because there's a blockade in that area. So they're giving boats to the actual people smugglers. You know, it's something straight out of Dr. Strangelove. Anyway, what's happened is now the government of Sri Lanka and Australia have signed a memorandum of understanding. And the memorandum of understanding is saying that the Sri Lankan government guarantees when the Tamils come back, they will be safe. Right? And when you look at their report, the reason they're saying they're safe is that somebody from the Australian Council would be at the airport to see them there. If they're not arrested at the airport, then everything is hunky-dory. That's their evidence. Now what we have is counter-evidence. We know that there's been a long civil war, basically over the self-determination of the Tamils. The Tamils lost that war. It was a brutal war, and human rights violations were galore. And I won't bore you with it. But basically what we know what happens is that the judicial system, if you are basically caught for petty criminal offenses, you can expect when you go in to basically get beaten up and a confession is given. And if you don't speak the majority language, the person beating you up doesn't speak your language. So the poor person then signs a statement in a language he doesn't even understand. He doesn't know what he signed, right? And then he or she has to wait for trial. And that trial could take 3 to 4 years. Now, if you are convicted for political offenses, just remember in Sri Lanka, dissent is seen as treason. Okay, so you probably you not only get a hammering, you'll probably be tortured. And then you might have to wait between 10 to 14 years in jail before you go to the courts. One case was 22 years. So that's because a lot of the Tamil refugees that are going back were involved in the war. They were low-level cadres for the Tigers. And we know from evidence what they do to these people. There are a number of detainees that are in prison at the moment. And torture is the normal course of events. So what's happening is terrible. And what we want to do is to alert the world to what's happening to them. And I think we should condemn the Australian government. I mean, I think the Sri Lankan government's beyond condemnation. I don't know. But anyway, that's my opinion. And we should put pressure on the Australian government to put a moratorium on deporting refugees till the Australian government can guarantee their safety. Otherwise, it's obscene. That's all I have to say.